Welcome back to the Rita Panahi Show. Joining me now is Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator and the best-selling author of The War on the West. Douglas, you've recently returned from Ukraine and we'll speak about your analysis about the war soon. But first, I want to ask you about the biggest sporting event in the world, the Soccer World Cup. It kicked off in Qatar today. And the moral posturing began too. We've got the England team vowing to take a knee. Douglas, what do you make of this activism?
It's incredibly tiresome, isn't it, Rita? I mean, it's sort of the epitome. I hope it's the epitome or a turning point in this whole nonsense game of our era. We spoke last week about the way in which this crypto firm collapsed and claimed all the way along until the end of it in this sort of Chaucerian fraud that they believed in ESG and DIE and all the other things that you're meant to agree to in this era. and they just pocketed billions and ran away with it. Well, it's the same thing with FIFA. I mean, FIFA is one of the world's most corrupt organizations. We've known that for years. We know that the World Cup is only in Qatar because Qatar's been able to bribe its way to it. And now, the players have this sort of baked into a political act or not. And frankly, I think like the fans all are totally bored of it. The idea that the England team would take the knee 2 years and a bit after George Floyd was killed in Minnesota by a policeman who's now serving life in jail. Why are they doing this? What's the point? Meanwhile, they're kneeling in front of a team of Iranians representing a nation whose government is currently massacring, raping and pillaging its way through the population of its own country because of women having the temerity to ask to be allowed to walk around freely without a hijab on. And, the Iranian players will stand there as their government is assaulting women in their country. And it's the England team opposite them taking the knee for something they have no involvement in and need say nothing about.
And I can tell you the Iranian people would much prefer the team not to be taking a knee, but to, I don't know, burn a hijab or come out in hijabs and take them off. Do something that signifies some sort of support from those brave women and men who are risking their lives trying to overturn that murderous regime. And Douglas, it's emerged today that FIFA have banned the English team from wearing the One Love armband at the World Cup. But I guess the team's not going to get on a plane and go home. They'll just do as they're told. So that moral posturing only goes so far. Now to Ukraine, and you've just been there in an active war zone, and you've come back with the opinion that Russia will lose this war. Tell my audience why you've reached that conclusion. I mean, we're talking about a nuclear power here.
Yeah, I just got back last night. I was in the south. I was all across the country, but primarily in the south, which is we've seen most of the fighting, or a lot of the fighting recently. And in one of the 4 regions that Vladimir Putin last month had this sort of crock referendum on. You'll remember that he announced that the people would have a vote as to whether or not they wanted to be annexed by Russia. And amazingly enough, his poll came back with a sort of 102% approval ratings of the public to be annexed by the Russians. In fact, these areas, and I think you're showing pictures from Kherson, which is one of the cities in the south that's just been liberated by the Ukrainians, was in one of those 4 regions that Vladimir Putin tried to claim ownership of. The Russians have retreated from there. They've been beaten back. Now, this is right by the bridge that was blown up more than a month ago that stopped Russian supplies being able to continually brought in. The Russian army is badly equipped. I've seen that for myself now. They are very badly equipped. They have no justification for being in Ukraine. They have very low morale on their own side, clearly, and appalling leadership, including appalling generalship. On the other side, the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives. They're fighting for their countries and their families. I met men and women on the front line who haven't been able to be rotated out, haven't seen their own families since Russia invaded earlier this year, but they know that they are fighting for their families, for their loved ones, for their country, for their independence, and not to be gobbled up by the Kremlin. And what I saw on the ground in terms of the fight and the success of the Ukrainian counteroffensive against the Russians persuades me, at any rate, that certainly Russia can't win this war. It just can't. It already hasn't won this war. It has already failed in the attempts that it tried to make earlier this year. And all the claims of Vladimir Putin have been shown to be ridiculous. And I'm sorry that so many people parrot them in the West. But it's perfectly clear to me that Ukrainians are winning the conflict, the Russians are losing, they are being beaten back, and the question now is not whether Vladimir Putin can hold on to the 4 regions he tried to annex this year, but whether or not he can even go back to the status quo ante of pre-2014 and hold on to the Crimea. I mean, I was down by the Crimea there, and it's going to be very interesting to see, because the Russian forces are depleted, are demoralized. They're throwing prisoners at the front line, and then when prisoners try to escape, they get shot by Russian snipers from their own side for desertion. The Russians are sending ill-equipped, badly demoralized troops at the front, and the Ukrainians are filled with morale and desire to win. And why wouldn't they be? Because they're fighting for their country.
I'd encourage everybody to read Douglas's piece in the New York Post about his trip to Ukraine. I think it'd be very illuminating indeed. Now, finally, I've got to ask you about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. They're receiving a Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award because of their courage to stand up to racism within the royal institution. Douglas, is this a well-deserved award? Perhaps it's not enough. Maybe the Nobel Peace Prize would be fitting for the duo.
Yes, I mean, isn't it horrible having the names of dead people abused in this way as well? Robbie Kennedy had many flaws, but he was also an extraordinary statesman and an extraordinary man, and displayed extraordinary personal courage himself. But to have his name sort of given over to the Sussexes, and for what? For standing up to racism in the royal family? They have provided no evidence of racism in the royal family. There is no evidence of racism in the royal family. The royal family is not racist. They're being given an award in the name of Robert Kennedy for doing something that they haven't done, for standing up to something that doesn't exist. I just wish, Rita, that, when you look around the world, you look at the women in Iran, you look at the men and women in Ukraine, you look at the people actually fighting totalitarianism and totalitarian governments, and that's a real fight. Moaning and whining from California takes no courage at all. It takes a level of imagination and fantasy, clearly, but it requires no courage. And I just wish that they would not accept such an award, or hand it over to people in the world who are actually doing the work that the Sussexes pretend to be doing.
Fat chance of that happening. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for joining me this evening.